Yesterday morning, I decided before breakfast to prepare my lecture and had a moment of panic because I discovered that the last 3 pages of my paper were missing. I hadn't printed them out.
Well, that's good now.
Well, I was tempted to rely on the tactics of one of my heroes, Nasruddin Hoxha. You might have heard the story of when Nasruddin Hoxha was on the lecture circuit. The problem was he hadn't prepared his lectures ahead of time, and so the first night he gets up and he says, "I presume that you all understand the theme and topic on which I'm about to speak this evening." And they said, "Yes, we do." He says, "Well, let's see how good your understanding is. You tell me what you think the topic is, and I'll tell you if you got it right." Well, the second night, he was speaking to a different audience, and he begins, "I presume you all understand well the topic that I'm speaking on this evening." And they said, "No, we don't." He said, "This is atrocious. You came without any preparation." He said, "We're going to have a research session right now. You go and study up on the topic and get prepared for it." Well, the third night, he was speaking to an entirely different audience, and he says, "I presume that you all understand well the topic on which I'm to speak this evening." And half the people said, "Yes, we do." And the other half said, "No, we don't." He says, "Aha, I see we have need for workshops. We should break into workshops so that those who understand the topic can explain it to those who do not." Well, fortunately, I didn't have to do that because the translators had a copy of my talk, and so I was able to reconstruct it that way. Well, let's get serious. Much has been written about the thought of Fethullah Gülen in terms of the social programs and institutions inspired by his ideas. Some have studied his theory of education as the pedagogical basis for the schools and other educational ventures founded and administered by members of the community associated with Gülen's name. Others have focused on his vision as the philosophical motor behind the social movement working to produce social change and renewal not only in Turkey, but also in the whole Islamic Ummah and generally in our modern world. Still others have underlined Gülen's call for universal love and fellowship and tolerance, and consequently his encouragement of interreligious dialogue as an essentially Islamic obligation. In this paper, though, I want to concentrate on another aspect of the thought of Fethullah Gülen, and one that I believe may prove in the long run to be the area of his greatest influence. That is his role as spiritual director and teacher of interiorized Islamic virtue, the function Gülen plays as spiritual master whose counsel has guided individual Muslims and formed a coherent and workable community life among his disciples. Thousands of Turks and others, ranging from students to businessmen to young professionals, look to Fethullah Gülen as their spiritual teacher whose advice and wisdom has shaped their understanding of the religion of Islam and their lives as Muslims in the modern world. I don't intend here to treat the whole gamut of spiritual advice offered by Fethullah Gülen to his disciples, but will instead focus on one central concept and try to show its role in maintaining a cohesive, Islamically motivated community life. This is the Quranic concept of ikhlas, which is usually translated into English either as purity of intention or sincerity. And both of these translations touch on an essential aspect of the Quranic notion of ikhlas. Sincerity obviously means honesty of mind, freedom from dissimulation or hypocrisy. A sincere person is one whose external words and deeds are in accord with their inner thoughts or feelings. So a sincere person does not dissimulate or pretend to be expressing one thought or emotion, while in reality his interior dispositions are to the contrary. So a sincere person is not self-promoting or hypocritical, pretentious, two-faced, or devious. A sincere person neither manipulates nor flatters others. It's to this aspect of sincerity that Jesus exhorted his disciples on the Sermon on the Mount, when he taught his disciples to say yes when they mean yes and no when they mean no. There's another aspect of the Quranic notion of ikhlas. This notion, which brings together the notion of purity with that of dedicating or devoting, consecrating oneself to something, is a key virtue in Islamic practice. Ikhlas is an eminently interior disposition by which the faithful Muslim performs all external actions in a spirit of service and directed totally to pleasing the divine Lord. In fact, the perfection of one's witness to faith can be gauged by the double standard of ikhlas, purity of intention, and ihsan, goodness. The importance of ikhlas has been commented on down through the centuries by Muslim scholars, exegetes, and spiritual guides in every generation. The Sufi masters have been particularly fond of commenting on this virtue, so that in the minds of many Muslims, ikhlas is considered a Sufi concept. In commenting on ikhlas, Sayyid Nursi must repeatedly distinguish his own advice from that of the teaching of the Sufis. While acknowledging the beneficial value of the instruction of the Sufi masters, he notes, "I am not a Sufi," I'm quoting him, but he says these principles of theirs make a good rule for our path. Turning to the way Fethullah Gülen looks at the question of ikhlas. He indicates that ikhlas means pursuing nothing worldly while worshiping and obeying God. At the deepest level, he says, sincerity can only be understood in the mystery of the relationship between God and God's faithful servant. Purity of intention is a grace or a divine gift that God places in the hearts of those God loves in order to increase and deepen and give eternal value to the servant's ordinary good acts. Gülen considers purity of intention to be the wing of the bird of a person's life before God. The other wing is faithfulness. And together the two virtues make up the two wings of divine grace that God implants in the soul, which enable a person to approach God directly without hindrance. He quotes Mevlana, Jalaluddin Rumi, to the effect that if good deeds were a body, purity of soul, purity of intention would be their soul. That is, it's sincerity that makes good deeds to live and be effective and have everlasting value. Without sincerity to animate deeds spiritually, all human endeavors would remain lifeless, ephemeral, and ultimately worthless. But those who fly with the two wings of sincerity and faithfulness will fly with God's protection and will unfailingly reach their destination, that is God's approval and pleasure. Gülen quotes Abu Yazid Bistami, Bayezid, to say that through sincerity, not through human deeds, a person goes to God. On the basis of a person's sincerity, God judges acts, not on the magnitude or the notoriety of the deed. The size and quantity of good deeds is unimportant. Even a small deed, says Gülen, or one that is unknown to others, if it is done with sincerity, is judged pleasing by God. Now keep these things in mind when you hear about the activities of the people in the Hizmet, whether it be the schools or the publications or whatever, that what really is giving value and making come alive their work is the sincerity, the purity of intention with which these things are done. Gülen notes that God rewards a small act done with purity of intention more highly than the many more ostentatious deeds done without the sincere desire to serve God alone. Gülen advises his disciples to maintain spiritual discretion. In practical terms, this means that if purity of intention demands that the servant do everything solely to seek God's pleasure and for no worldly motive whatsoever, it follows that sincere believers should not be ostentatious in the good deeds they perform. One seeking God's pleasure should hide supererogatory acts from the view of others and remain silent about any edifying personal experiences or special treatment received from superiors or special gifts with which one has been blessed by God. Gülen's point here is that there's a universal human tendency to perform one's good deeds in order to be seen by others and gain their approval. Moreover, human motivation is often complex, with the desire to serve God mixed with a craving for human admiration and approval. The sincere servant recognizes that it's only God's approval, not that of other persons, that matters. It's unimportant whether or not one is seen to be serving God. A person who does everything with purity of intention worries neither about being praised for his accomplishments nor censured for his failures. He does not care if others are aware or unaware of his achievements, nor is he preoccupied about receiving an award. Such a person behaves with consistency, whether or not one is in public or in private. Now, according to Gülen, sincerity teaches us that it's God's pleasure, not human recognition or respect, that's the true goal of our acts of piety and goodness. Moreover, in sincere worship, we discover that our human longing for paradise is not a sufficient motivation for doing what is right. Speaking of worship, Gülen teaches, he says, those performing acts of worship can be categorized by their intention and sincerity as follows. There are those who do these things in order to get into paradise. There are those who hope to be rescued from hellfire. There's also those who love and stand before God. And there's those who feel that they must worship as a requirement of their relationship between God and the Creator and human beings. In other words, the sincere worshiper no longer cares whether his deeds will form the basis for attaining paradise. In fact, Gülen says, sincerity should become second nature to God's servants, not a virtue after which a person consciously needs to strive. He advises his disciples to be so involved in worship and religious deeds, in seeking God's pleasure, that one does not even remember whether or not one should be sincere. In other words, even the virtue of sincerity itself must not be allowed to become the final goal of religious observance. The only true objective in the performance of any good act is to serve and obey God and to thereby give God pleasure and the satisfaction that is due him. To achieve this, Gülen says the disciples must engage in self-examination and self-supervision. Only the person who has learned to be honest with oneself will be able to know whether one's motivation is solely to worship God or whether the true incentive that is being pursued is some worldly gain, such as self-satisfaction, human respect, or personal ambition. Thus, developing a habit of honest evaluation and reflection will enable a person to grow in purity of intention. Gülen calls this muraqabah, that is, self-examination, self-supervision, by which God's servants are led, and I quote him, to maintain the purity of thoughts, actions, and intentions, even when they are alone in the consciousness of his continual observation. This really struck a bell with me as a Jesuit, because our spiritual master, St. Ignatius, he advises us that even in the busiest of days, there are two spiritual exercises we should never allow to miss. And those are the two moments of self-examination, or what we call the daily examen, trying to see God, how God is at work in our lives. And we try to do this twice a day. So when I read Gülen saying something very similar, I thought, yes, I understand what he's talking about. Well, our time is running out, so I'll conclude. The history of many religious groups has shown repeatedly that it's jealousy and competition among members that is the cause of factionalism, resentment, and divisions among rival groups. Similarly, it's sincerity that enables God's servants to keep focused on serving God alone, thus making their actions, whether they're great or small, acceptable to God. Now, if Gülen has been able to instill a sense of harmony and united service, hizmet, among his followers, it's largely because of the emphasis that he has put, I believe, on purity of intention. And he cites Mevlana to this effect. So I quote Mevlana as cited by Fethullah Gülen. He says, "You should be sincere in all your deeds, so that the majestic Lord may accept them. Sincerity is the wing of the bird of the acts of obedience. Without a wing, how can you ever fly to the abode of happiness?" Thank you. Is that on? Yeah. Oh, sorry. First of all, I would like to confirm what Gökhan has said about the movement, the Gülen movement in the United States has not been subject to the same kind of suspicion or accusations that you find in Holland and in other European countries. The movement has been tremendously active, not so much in schools as in dialogue centers, of which there are more than 50. Virtually every city of any size in the United States and every university town has a dialogue center. And this has been very important. I can remember talking to a Catholic priest in New Jersey, and he says, our town has been transformed by these Turks. That's what he called them, these Turks. He said, I first met the rabbi in town at the Turkish Cultural Center. And so there is a very different dynamic there. But to respond to the question about ikhlas, when this has been commented on, this concept by Muslims in every century, but when Fethullah Gülen focuses on ikhlas, there are these two ideas that are always there. The one is that ikhlas is an element of the mystery of the person's individual relationship to God. Ikhlas is when whatever we do, whether it's picking up people at the airport or whether it's providing drinks at the coffee break, if you do this for God, this has a value which only God knows and only God rewards. And the second aspect of Ikhlas, which is important to Gülen, is in the unity of the community. How is unity maintained in the community? Well, nothing breaks a community apart more than some people going after privileges or ambition or rivalry or competition. But the focus on Ikhlas helps people to maintain that unity by seeing that everything that's done is done only for the pleasure of God. These are the two foci that we find in Gülen's treatment of Ikhlas. Yes, very quickly. Usually when we raise questions about the Sharia, at least in the West, what we want to talk about is the civil application of the Sharia as civil law. And I have not found either Mr. Gülen or members of the movement being very much concerned about this. However, the Sharia at its deepest level means the Islamic way of life, and it is incumbent upon the conscience of Muslims to live this way. And you find this so much being talked about in the preaching of Fethullah Gülen, down not only to the obligatory or wajib aspects of the Sharia, but the sunnah or the recommended, the exhortatory aspects of the Sharia. I would say is very important element of the way of life that Fethullah Gülen recommends is to be followed by his disciples.